Welcome back, students, to yet another teaching module in economics. We are beginning with another topic that comes under demand analysis, which is elasticity of demand. In this lesson, we will learn about the concept of elasticity of demand and the factors affecting elasticity of demand. So let us begin. What is elasticity of demand? It is the degree of responsiveness of quantity demanded of a good to a change in the price of the good itself. In other words, how much the demand for a good changes as a result of change in price of a good. So in the slides that follow, we will take various examples and try and understand how demand changes for different goods due to a change in price. As we are studying the topic of elasticity of demand, I would like you to keep in mind that for some goods, a small change in price brings about a big change in quantity demanded. And for other goods, a big change in price brings about a small change in quantity demanded. So you will see that for some goods, the demand curve is sloped in a different way. As you can see, this first diagram, we call it the relatively elastic demand curve. The slope of the demand curve is rather flat. And that reflects this small change in price brings about a big change in quantity demanded. Whereas in the relatively inelastic demand, it reflects that a big change in price brings about a small change in quantity demanded. And as you can see, the slope of this demand curve, that is relatively inelastic demand curve, is rather steep. It's like going on a steep road. And this one here, it's like walking on a flat surface. So it's much flatter. The relatively elastic demand curve is flatter and the relatively inelastic demand curve is steeper. Please remember this as we are going forward. Here is something to help you remember and connect to what we are studying today. You can see in the picture here, there's a girl applying slight pressure on an elastic band. A little pressure and the band is quite elastic. So it is with a case of relatively elastic demand that we saw in the previous slide. We saw that a small change in price brings about a big change in quantity demanded. So now you can understand why we say that demand is relatively elastic. Because as she applies small pressure on the band, so it is a small pressure of the price and there's a big change in quantity demanded. So we call it the relatively elastic demand curve because that's the way demand reacts to a small change in price. Let's move on to the next picture. You can see here a tremendous amount of pressure is applied and yet the band is not so elastic. So it is with a case of relatively inelastic demand. There is a big change in price, yet the quantity demanded doesn't change much. So this is a good example for you to remember what is relatively inelastic demand. The demand does not react much to a big change in price. So just imagine the pressure applied is the change in price. And how elastic the two different bands are is the change in the demand for different goods, whether they are relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. Just as we studied the factors affecting demand, we are now going to study what are the factors that affect the elasticity of demand. How elastic the demand for a particular good is depends on certain factors. So that is what we are going to study here on. The first factor affecting elasticity of demand is nature of the commodity. Necessities like salt, textbooks, seasonal vegetables, and goods like life-saving medicines have relatively inelastic demand, while luxuries like ACs, costly furniture, diamonds have relatively elastic demand. In the next slide, with the help of diagrams, we will study this concept or this particular feature or factor in a better way. So here we can see that luxurious goods like AC costly furniture, and diamonds have relatively elastic demand. The demand curve will be flatly sloped, which reflects that a small change in price brings about a big change in quantity demanded. Let's take the example of diamonds. It is noticed that if the price of diamonds falls by a small amount, the quantity demanded of diamonds increases to a large extent because the price of diamonds rarely falls, and if it does, it falls by a small amount. So people react by demanding more of diamonds and take advantage of the slight fall in the price of diamonds. So it will be with the case of ACs and costly furniture. Whereas the demand for necessity goods or necessities like salt, textbooks, life-saving medicines will be relatively inelastic. The demand curve will be steeply sloped. In the case of these goods, a big change in price will bring about a small change in demand. Just take the example of salt. If the price of salt increases to a large extent, how will we react? Will we demand less of salt? We will continue to demand salt, but perhaps the demand will fall by a small amount. So a big change in price brings about a small change in quantity demanded. The same will be for the case of other necessary goods. The second factor affecting elasticity of demand is availability of substitutes. The demand for goods which have close substitutes like tea and coffee, Pepsi and Coke is relatively elastic because when price of such goods rise, the consumers shift their demand to the substitute goods. Whereas goods which have no substitutes like cigarettes, salt, alcohol, petrol have relatively inelastic demand. So here we see in the case of goods that have substitute goods, they show relatively elastic demand, which means a slight rise or fall in the price will result in a big change in quantity demanded. Let us take the example of tea. If the price of tea rises by a small amount, the quantity demanded of tea will fall to a large extent. This is because all the consumers will shift their demand to coffee, and so the demand for tea will fall to a large extent, and therefore we say that goods that have substitutes like Pepsi and Coke also have relatively elastic demand. Whereas goods that have no substitutes like cigarettes, salt, alcohol, petrol, they display relatively inelastic demand. A big change in its price brings about a small change in the quantity demanded. For example, people who have the habit of smoking. I'm not endorsing smoking at all. I fully discourage it. But I'm just taking it as an example. If the price of cigarettes rise to a large extent, the people who have the habit of smoking will not change their demand to a large extent. So you see, the demand for goods that have no substitutes is relatively inelastic. The third factor affecting elasticity of demand is diversity of uses. Commodities that have variety of uses have elastic demand. For example, electricity has many uses like lighting, air conditioning, cooking and so on. If price of electricity rises, it is used only for important purposes. But goods like paper, which have only few uses, have relatively inelastic demand. So we see that for goods that have many uses like electricity, the demand will be relatively elastic. A slight change in the cost of electricity will result in a big change in the quantity demanded. For example, if the price of electricity rises, people may stop using their ACs, for example. So the consumption will be less. They will go for the more urgent or more necessary uses of electricity. Let's move on to the next good that has few uses like paper. If the price of paper rises to a large extent, the quantity demanded of paper will not fall to a large extent. So you see that the demand for paper is relatively inelastic. The fourth factor affecting elasticity of demand is income of the consumer. If the buyer of a good has a high level of income, his demand will not change much, even if the price changes to a large extent. The demand will be relatively inelastic. For those of lower income groups, a slight change in price will bring a big change in demand. The demand is relatively elastic. If the buyer of a good has a low level of income, even if the price changes to a small extent, the demand will change to a large extent. For example, if the price rises from OP1 to OP2 slightly, the quantity demanded will fall from OQ1 to OQ2 by a large extent. This is because for a person belonging to lower levels of income, his purchasing power reduces even if the price rises slightly. Whereas for a person belonging to a high level of income, even if the price changes to a large extent, his demand will not be affected because to him it doesn't make a difference since his level of income is high. So for those people having high level of income, the demand for goods will be relatively inelastic. A big change in price will not affect their demand much for the simple reason is because they have the purchasing power. The fifth factor affecting elasticity of demand, habit of the consumers. If the person has a habit of consuming a particular good, for example, cigarettes and alcohol, their demand will be relatively inelastic. Even with a big change in price, their demand doesn't change much. For those who don't have the habit, the demand will be relatively elastic. So here we have the diagrams to help us to understand this better. If a person has the habit of consuming a particular good, for example, cigarettes and alcohol, I'm just taking these as examples. Even if the price of cigarettes rises to a large extent, because the person has a habit, he will not change his demand much on account of having the habit of consuming it. But for a person who doesn't have a habit, his demand for goods will be relatively elastic. A slight change in the price will bring about a big change in demand for the simple reason because the person doesn't need it. Because the person doesn't have the habit of consuming that particular good. So for those people who don't have a habit of consuming any particular good, their demand for such goods will be relatively elastic. The next factor affecting elasticity of demand is price level. When the price level of a good is high, the demand for it will be relatively elastic. For example, all expensive goods like an expensive car. However, low-priced goods have relatively inelastic demand. For example, salt. Diagrammatically, the point explained. When the price level of a good is high, example expensive cars, a slight change in price will result in a big change in quantity demanded. For the simple reason is because these goods are expensive and their price rarely drops. So if it drops even slightly, expensive cars, the demand for expensive cars will increase to a large extent because people like to take advantage of even this small fall or change in price. So the demand for expensive cars or high priced goods is relatively elastic. Conversely, when the price level of a good is low, for example salt, even a big change in price will not affect the demand much. So even if the price of salt rises to a large extent, people will still demand salt. Maybe slightly the demand will fall, but not all that much. So the demand for low priced goods is relatively inelastic. The seventh factor affecting elasticity of demand is time period. Demand in the long run or long period is relatively elastic since consumers have time to change their demand, whereas demand in the short period is relatively inelastic since the time is too short to react to a change in price. Example, urgent need of a taxi. If a person is in urgent need of a taxi, maybe to go to GMC urgently, he will be willing to pay any price. His demand will not change much. But if there is a lot of time to change the demand, even a slight change in price, the demand will change to a large extent. For example, if I'm not in a hurry to go to GMC, and even if the taxi offers me a slight increase in the normal price, I will not want to take the taxi simply because I have a long time period and the want is not so urgent. The eighth factor affecting elasticity of demand is postponement of consumption. If the consumption of a good can be postponed, the demand will be elastic. Example, people often postpone their demand for residential houses when the interest rate on loans are high. So if the rate of interest on housing loans rises slightly, the demand for housing loans will fall to a large extent because people feel they can postpone their demand. On the other hand, if the want is urgent, then the demand is relatively inelastic. For example, if I need to go by flight urgently, maybe to Delhi or Bombay, and I cannot postpone it, a big change in price, I am willing to pay whatever price, my demand will not change much. The ninth factor affecting elasticity of demand is proportion of income spent on the good. Goods on which consumers spend a large proportion of their income will have elastic demand. So for example, if in our monthly income, a large proportion of our income goes on a particular good, if that particular good's price rises even to a small extent, the demand for it will fall to a large extent. Whereas goods on which the consumer spends a small proportion of their income, for example, newspapers, needles, matchboxes, will have relatively inelastic demand. As you can see in the case of newspapers, needles and matchboxes, hardly any proportion of our income goes on that. They're very low priced. So even if their price increases to a large extent, their demand will not change much. And so the demand for these type of goods is relatively inelastic. Whereas goods on which we spend a large proportion of our income, the demand for it is relatively elastic. I've provided for you a table here showing the factors affecting elasticity of demand. And on either sides, I have shown examples of goods that are coming under the category of relatively elastic demand and examples of goods falling under the category of relatively inelastic demand for each of the points respectively. I need you to reproduce a similar table in your notes. Go through all the points, all the factors affecting elasticity of demand, and fill up the examples in both these columns, just as I have done here. So in this slide, I've not included factor 8 and 9. But you have to reproduce it in your book, the way I have shown it in this slide. Today, we have learnt about the concept of elasticity of demand. We have learnt about two types of elasticities, that is relatively elastic demand and relatively inelastic demand. And we have learnt about all the factors affecting elasticity of demand. Let me mention here that we will be studying in the following lessons about the other types of elasticities of demand. In order to help you to understand the factors affecting elasticity of demand, I had to teach you first these two types, that is relatively elastic and relatively inelastic demand. Here are a few questions to check out how well you have learned. Let's take the first one. The elasticity of demand for salt is relatively inelastic. The second one, the elasticity of demand for goods that are high priced is relatively inelastic. The third one, the elasticity of demand for goods that people consume as a matter of habit is relatively inelastic. The elasticity of demand for necessary goods is relatively inelastic. The elasticity of demand for goods where people spend a small proportion of their income is relatively inelastic. The elasticity of demand for a good like Pepsi that has substitutes is relatively elastic. The elasticity of demand for goods like paper that have few uses is relatively inelastic. The elasticity of demand for a good that is urgently needed is relatively inelastic. Ninth one, the elasticity of demand for flight tickets when time is short is relatively inelastic. Well, I hope you have been able to answer them with me, but I need you to rewrite these fill in the blanks in your notebook and answer them. We have come to the end of this particular teaching module. Please revise the factors affecting elasticity of demand and look forward to the next class, as I too am looking forward to the next class. I would urge you to watch the video again so that you clearly understand the concepts thoroughly. Thank you so much.